6 men ride into an undefended river crossing. None of them come out. That is Takeda Shingen introducing himself to Richard the Lionheart, and it is his entire method in one move.
Leave the door open. Kill whoever walks through it.
Richard has to cross that river. Shingen has something near 20,000 men on the slope above it and no intention of coming down to meet him, and the thumbnail has already sold you the wrong fight. This is not two swordsmen. Richard's charge is the most destructive single act available to a commander of his century, and Shingen has spent 30 years building the kind of thing that eats it. So put the katana away. It's a sidearm and it stays on the hip. What is waiting up that slope is spears more than twice a man's height in blocks hundreds deep, foot archers behind them, and matchlocks on the high ground above the water. He is not a cavalry commander either, whatever you have heard about the Takeda. The picture of massed horsemen breaking a line leans hard on an army staff study written in 1903 and on Edo period writing about Nobunaga. The accounts closest to the fighting describe something quieter, men putting their horses at the back and going forward on foot. Whatever the Takeda were, they were not a shock army. What Shingen commands is depth. One river, one ford. Both men need the far side of it. And here is the shape of it. Shingen is trying to make Richard spend his shock power against prepared depth. Richard is trying to control where and when that power gets spent. Neither wants to commit first, and the ground is about to decide which of them can afford to wait. Let me set the model out plainly, because the fairness of it is the exercise. Shingen, at the height of his campaigning years, near 20,000, massed spearmen, foot archers, a body of matchlocks, a reserve held back, and 2 days on the ground spent digging and dressing the line. Richard at Arsuf's strength, near 12,000, something over 1,000 knights, a strong body of crossbowmen, infantry to hold whatever the horse takes. He arrives second, tired, outnumbered. That reads one-sided and isn't. Richard picks the hour. His crossbows outrange and outpower the bows facing him. Not a guess. The chronicler Baha al-Din watched exactly that at Arsuf, and Shingen's army, once set on that slope, is close to immobile. Few horses, small ones, and no way to chase what he doesn't kill. Richard can leave. Shingen cannot follow. Victory isn't symmetrical either. Richard has to get across. Shingen only has to still be there at dusk. This ford is the only one for 2 days' march either way. Upstream, the river runs into a gorge with cliffs on both banks. Downstream, it spreads into marsh that will not carry a horse, let alone a cart, and the rains have started. Richard can't build a crossing. That is 2 weeks he doesn't have, watched by scouts who know he doesn't have it. There is no way around, and he can't simply wait Shingen out, which is the part people assume he can. Here is why. At Arsuf, his fleet shadowed the column and fed it. There is no coast here. He is 9 days from supply, living on what the valley grows, and a valley this size feeds an army like his for under a fortnight. His horses eat before his men do, and forage runs out first. His crossbowmen have the bolts they carried, and no way to make more. Behind Shingen, a road runs north into country the Takeda already hold. Shingen's clock is real too. Kai is mountains and poor soil, and an army far from home eats another province's harvest on a schedule. He can't stand there forever. He can stand there 3 weeks longer than Richard can stand in front of him, and both of them know it. Which brings us back to the 6 men and to how an undefended crossing kills people. Shingen has left the waterline genuinely empty and put archers in a dry watercourse that cuts across the far bank, below the sightline from the south side. The scouts ride in, find nothing, climb the bank to see further, and take their first arrows from ground they have already ridden past. Then a dozen horsemen come down the slope behind them and close the way back. For 6 men, Richard buys the most useful thing available to him. The open ground is bait. Shingen leaves doors open to see who walks through them, and he does not mind spending an afternoon to teach that lesson once. So he goes and looks at what he has to break. 3 belts, stepped up a slope that rises about 40 meters from water to crest. The first sits back from the ford, far enough that anything crossing climbs wet before it arrives. The second is roughly 150 paces behind it. The third is on the crest with the banner. 4 words about wind, forest, fire, and mountain, and only the last is working today. The reserve waits behind the second belt, out of sight of the water. The spacing is a model assumption. Nobody wrote it down. The principle isn't. Each belt is spearmen in deep blocks, shafts long enough that the third and fourth ranks reach past the front, 4 meters and change, which is what the sources support for the period. Matchlocks sit above the ford exit, where anything leaving the water climbs towards them at a walk. There is a man in the 4th rank of the second belt. He can see the river over the heads in front of him. He has been there since before light, and won't touch an enemy for 6 hours. Richard opens with what he does best, which is not charging. He puts crossbowmen on the south bank and works the first belt. This part he wins outright. The bolts reach, most of the arrows coming back don't, and the ones that do arrive with less behind them. Men in the front ranks go down. The ranks behind step up. The belt doesn't move. Over a morning, it costs Shingen a few hundred out of many thousands, and costs Richard bolts he cannot replace. The man in the 4th rank watches it happen to the belt in front of him, and is not shot at once. So, Richard can hurt Shingen all day, and cannot make him leave, and every hour of it comes off a clock, running against only one of them. I know how that reads, a long stretch of battle where nobody has attacked anything. Stay with me, because the reason nobody is attacking is the whole fight, and it is about to force Richard into the open. He marches downstream. Not the knights, everything. The whole column comes off the bank and moves west along the south side at the pace of infantry, in full view. There is a shallow section 4 miles down that a determined army could probably force, and he makes very sure it is obvious he intends to look at it. This is what he is better at than anyone alive, and it is not charging. It is moving a large force under observation without letting it come apart, which he did for a whole day at Arsuf while being shot at specifically to stop him. Shingen now has 2 bad options. Stay, and Richard forces the shallows, comes up the north bank, and arrives behind the position, where the road north is, which is where the Takeda food comes from. Move the whole line west, and he abandons the ford, and Richard turns around and walks across the thing they have all been staring at for 2 days. His reserve sits behind the second belt, too far back to cover the western approach in time, and the slope splits his frontage. The belts cannot slide sideways as one body. His scouts confirm the march is real, which is the worst thing they could confirm, because now he cannot ignore it as a feint. So he shifts 2 blocks off the western end of the first belt, sends them downstream, and leaves everything else where it is. That is a reasonable decision, and it opens a seam. The gap sits at the western shoulder of the first belt, between the blocks walking away and the ones that stayed, and it stays open longer than anyone would like, for reasons that are all boring and all real. The moving blocks cross the same broken ground everyone has been standing on. Old terracing, the dry watercourse, scrub. A formation is strongest dressed and still. Crossing ground like that opens the intervals that make its frontage dangerous, and closing them again takes time. Orders travel by flag and drum along a slope with a fold in it. And the crossbows never stop, which makes standing up to redress a decision with a price on it. Richard has spent the morning buying exactly this. He does not notice the gap. He built it, and then he turns the column around. What follows is a sequence, not a charge. Infantry goes into the ford first and takes the far bank, not to hold it, to own the exit for the 20 minutes that matter. The crossbows walk their fire off the first belt and onto the seam and the slope above it, where the matchlocks are. The knights form on the south bank, behind the infantry, out of sight of the crest, and wait. Richard holds them until the western blocks are far enough downstream to be committed, because a block that can still turn around is not a gap. Then he sends them across. Here the guns get their say, and it is worth slowing down, because this is the mechanism everyone expects to settle it, and it settles nothing either way. A matchlock of this generation is effective at something like 80 to 100 meters, longer than the popular version allows, and it matters, because the approach here is not a gallop across a field, it's a walk through a river. Horses enter the water, slow to near walking pace, climb a churned bank, reorganize on ground already fought over, and only then start up a 40-meter slope. From the moment the leaders are inside range to the moment they reach the guns is not 5 seconds. It is long enough for several organized volleys. The guns get them, and a good part of Richard's losses for the day happen in the water and on the bank. What they cannot do is settle it. Reloading is slow enough that a contemporary estimate has an archer loosing many arrows in the time it takes to charge and fire once, so the volleys arrive in widely spaced blocks rather than a wall. Whether a ball defeats mail at that range is genuinely disputed. Some accounts have shot going through almost any armor, others have it deflecting at exactly this distance. And the crossbows are working the gun line throughout, thinning every volley that lands. What comes up the slope is smaller and slower than what entered the water. It is still coming. It hits the seam. The block on the western shoulder is still redressing when the knights arrive, and that is why this works. Its front rank has been under crossbow fire for 10 minutes and is holding shields where it should be holding spears. Its intervals are open from the move. Its flank is a shoulder rather than a face, and a spear frontage is only dangerous in the direction it points. Richard comes in along the shoulder instead of the front. The men in there fight. They are not victims. They are drilled spearmen who kill several knights in the first minute and drag others off their horses in the crush. But they are being taken from a direction they would have to turn their whole bodies to face, and they are packed too tightly to turn. The ranks fold inward, away from the horses, into the men behind, and a spear block that compresses cannot use its spears. Within minutes, the western end of the first belt has stopped functioning as a formation. That is Richard's afternoon, and it is entirely earned. He read the position, made Shingen move, paid for the crossing in the water, and broke a prepared line with half the numbers facing him. And it changes nothing structural, which is the turn of this battle. Behind the wreckage, the second belt is standing where it has stood since before dawn, untouched, dressed, facing him. Shingen's answer is the hardest thing he does all day, and he does it at once. He doesn't try to save the broken block. He commits the reserve from behind the second belt into the ground between the two, across the base of the slope, where it can neither hold nor win. Its job is to occupy the space Richard needs, while the second belt closes its intervals and the western blocks come back up from downstream. They know what that is. It costs most of them, and it works, which has to be said plainly, because the verdict rests on it. The knights come through the reserve and reach the second belt, and by then they have been fighting a quarter of an hour, and moving for an hour before that. The man in the fourth rank has been on that slope since before light. He watched a crossbow duel he was not part of. He watched the belt in front of him come apart in about the time it takes to say so. Now there are knights in front of him, at a walk, on blown horses, with their weight spent. This is the lock. A charge converts speed into shock once. Cavalry that has spent it on a formation and then a reserve is tired men on tired horses inside a frontage that hasn't moved since dawn. And 4 meters of shaft reaches a rider before a lance held at 2 reaches the man holding it. The second belt doesn't break. It doesn't have to do anything clever. It only has to be there, dressed, when Richard's weapon has nothing left in it. Richard is in it, because he always is. He took a spear in the side once, in a skirmish he had no business near, and nothing about that ever changed. His household get him out, which is a short sentence covering a great deal. The knights come back down through the wreck of the first belt. The crossbows cover them across the water exactly as they covered the march, and by evening, the north bank looks close to how it looked at dawn, minus a belt, minus a reserve, plus a great many bodies in the ford. Shingen has not advanced a meter. He never intended to. Before we call it, the case for Richard is stronger than the result, and it should be made properly. At Arsuf, he did a harder version of this, and won. A column of around 20,000 marched a whole morning under mounted archery aimed at one purpose, making the knights break formation, and the eyewitness, Baha al-Din recorded that it failed, and that the Franks held themselves with remarkable self-control. Then Richard chose his moment, and Saladin lost thousands of men and a long list of his emirs in an afternoon, and concluded afterwards that he could neither get into that formation nor draw it out. Shingen is trying to solve a problem that beat a better commander than him. Richard doesn't lose this because he's outthought. He finds the position's one weakness, manufactures it into an opening, pays for the crossing, and breaks a prepared line. On most ground in his century, that is the battle. But under these conditions, Shingen holds the ford. What decides it is depth, and specifically that Richard's weapon is a single transaction. Shock converts speed into damage once. Spend it on a belt and a reserve, and what arrives at the next frontage is a crowd of tired men on tired horses. Shingen did not need a better weapon than Richard. He needed one more line than Richard had charges. The turn of the battle is that the second belt was never touched. The moment that decided the shape of it is Shingen choosing to spend his reserve instead of trying to rescue the block he had already lost. And the lock is what the fourth rank was for. The bill isn't symmetrical, and this needs care. Shingen loses more men, most of a spear block, most of a reserve, a steady drain across a morning of crossbow fire, and those losses are not free. Kai is not a deep well, and he will feel this next season. Richard loses fewer men and a far worse share of the thing that matters, several hundred out of a mounted arm of something over 1,000, unreplaceable anywhere within 1,000 miles of this river. Horses least of all. He can absorb the infantry, he cannot absorb the knights, and he gets across nothing. He came for the crossing, he leaves with an army, in order, behind a crossbow screen, and a campaign that needed the far bank. Take away the second prepared belt and the reserve that bought time behind it, and Richard's breakthrough has a credible route to the crest, and the ford is probably lost. Not certainly. The guns are still on that slope, the western blocks are still coming back, and the day is still long. But depth is what turns a successful charge into a spent one, and depth is not free. It is cheaper than trying to stop a charge at its strongest point, and it is paid for by the men standing where the first impact was always going to land. This is a model, not a record. The largest assumption is the shape of the position itself. 3 belts, that spacing, that reserve, which is reconstructed rather than recorded. The casualty figures are derived from frontage, hours engaged, and the weapon effects described, and I have given them as proportions rather than counts because nothing here supports a real number. The genuinely contested claims are 2. How far a matchlock ball of this generation defeats Mail, where the sources disagree outright, and the Takeda cavalry question itself, where the modern picture rests on later writing rather than on the accounts closest to the fighting. The nearest real precedents are Arsuf for Richard's method and Mikatagahara for Shingen's, and that second one comes to us through a Takeda family record, which is worth knowing. The banner is still on the crest. Nobody moved it. That was the point of it.